pray. Well, Lord, maybe our faith still is in kindergarten this morning, but if it is, we know you want to help us move along. Open up our hearts now to hear you speak. Amen. One day a man was out hiking on a trail near the edge of some cliffs when he suddenly lost his balance and went right over the side. Fortunately, he managed to grab a tree limb on the way down, and when the shock had settled, he found himself hanging there on the side of the cliff. Although the man wasn't an avid churchgoer, he knew about God and had attended church a few times in his life. So he decided to give it a try and call out for help. "Is anyone up there?" He was shocked to hear an audible reply. "I am here. I am the Lord. Do you believe me?" "Yes, Lord, I believe," he said. "I really believe, but I can't hang on much longer." "That's all right," God said. "If you really believe, you have nothing to worry about. I will save you. Just let go of the branch." The man paused for a moment, thinking, and finally said, "Is anyone else up there?" Faith. I have often thought about faith as a static reality, haven't you? You either have faith or you don't. There's not really any halfway. It's kind of like pregnancy. You can't be sort of pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. Then again, pregnancy is a very long process. For you are just as pregnant on the first day as you are on the day of the birth. There's a world of difference between the two. A lot has happened between those two dates. I know a lot about that. I got pregnant with each of my girls in January, and that meant I went through 2 hot, humid Michigan summers in the 3rd trimester. Let me tell you, those latter days of pregnancy didn't feel anything like the earlier days. And the same is true for faith. You do either have faith or you don't. But faith begins as a tiny thing. Jesus even referred to it once as a small seed. But as your relationship with God grows, so does your faith. For as we saw in our scripture for today, he is very, very intentional about helping it to blossom and grow in our hearts. At the beginning of this story, Jesus has just left Samaria, where if you were here last week and remember the story of the Samaritan woman at the well, she went into the town and said, "Hey everybody, come meet this guy who told me everything I ever did." And they all came. And then they begged him to stay with them. So he had spent 2 days ministering to people there in Samaria whose hearts were open to him. And then he decided to return to Galilee, where people were a bit more, shall we say, skeptical. Although John does say that Jesus was welcomed because many of them had heard some of the stories that came back from the Passover in Jerusalem and what he had done there. Now, Jesus didn't go just anywhere in Galilee. He returned to Cana, the site of his very first miracle, when he turned the water into wine. And one day, when he was sitting among a crowd of people, perhaps teaching, a nobleman came from Capernaum, which was about 20 miles away, and he begged Jesus to come back with him to Capernaum and heal his dying son. Now, what would we expect Jesus to say at such a moment? Tender, gentle, compassionate Jesus. I think we'd expect just about anything other than what Jesus actually said. "Will you never believe in me unless you see miraculous signs and wonders?" That could almost sound harsh and unbelievably cruel to a desperate father. But the Greek clues us into the fact that the "you" there, "will you never believe," is plural. Meaning Jesus wasn't just addressing the Father with these words, but rather the crowd of people who had gathered there. In that context, then, perhaps these words weren't said in exasperation, but really more of a question. Are you going to believe unless you see? Are you willing to put your faith in me without first seeing? Whatever tone of voice Jesus used, it certainly didn't deter the Father, who repeated his plea, Lord, please come now before my little boy dies. So we can say this about that Father. He had faith in Jesus, did he not? However it was that he'd heard of Jesus, he knew enough and believed enough to know that if Jesus came with him, he would be able to heal his boy. He believed in the presence of the Lord, that to be physically with him means life and health and vitality. If he could only persuade him to come. But Jesus would not be persuaded. Go back home, he told the man. Your son lives. Now I find that very interesting. Only Jesus could refuse and grant a request in the same breath. He refused to go with the man to Capernaum, but at the same time, he claimed to have granted the request for the boy's healing. Why did he do this? I believe he was giving this father an opportunity to take his faith to the next level. To no longer just believe in what Jesus could do, but to believe in who he was. We could summarize this entire conversation in contemporary language this way. That Jesus, in effect, had said to the Father and to the people there, are you one of those seeing is believing kind of people? And the Father replied, Sir, I'm just a desperate father. My little boy is dying and I need your help. And in effect, Jesus replied, believe then, and you will see. It's not that Jesus minds providing signs and miracles and wonders. He did many of these things when he was here. Often, these sorts of things provide a tenuous basis for a fledgling faith. The problem is when we remain stuck in that kind of faith. Not only because there are more and better reasons for us to trust God, but because people who ought not to be trusted can sometimes produce what appear to be signs and wonders. To come to the place where we believe God without seeing is a higher level of faith. Because this sort of faith is not grounded in what God can do, but it's grounded in who he is. Is he authoritative? Is he trustworthy? Is he the kind of person who keeps his word? This is what the Father had to face. This was the struggle, to choose to turn and leave without the thing he thought he needed. To go home without a guarantee. And just imagine what happened in his heart when he learned that his son became well at the very moment Jesus spoke the words, your son lives. I imagine he was overcome with the realization of not what Jesus could do, but of who he was. That he had authority over all illness. That he was not limited by distance or time. That he had power in areas beyond the knowledge and reach of all men. Jesus gently moved this father from trusting in his presence to trusting in his character. And he wants to move us along in the same faith journey as well. To come to trust God for who he is, not just for what he can do. Perhaps he'd like to move us along from having enough faith to be healed to having enough faith to not be healed. Perhaps he'd like to move us along from proclaiming the assurance of our salvation to proclaiming assurance in the one who's saving us. He'd like us to know, as he would tell Thomas after the resurrection, that his word is just as good as his touch. This story reminds us that we are in the hands of one who doesn't always answer our prayers in the way we want or expect, so that he can lift us up to a higher awareness of who he is, of his authority and power in the world and in life. As a result, our faith becomes stronger, and we're enabled to exercise it at a far higher level. Famous NFL football coach Tom Landry once said, "The job of a coach is to make men do what they don't want to do in order to help them achieve what they really want." Let me say that again. The job of a coach is to make men do what they don't want to do in order to help them achieve what they really want. This is what Jesus does in the course of perfecting our faith. He allows us to go through circumstances we don't want to go through and face things we don't want to face in order to achieve that thing that our hearts are really yearning and longing for. For just as the woman at the well found out, Jesus is the living water, the only thing that can quench our every thirst. And the more he perfects our faith, the deeper we can drink from that life-giving well. May we have the courage to believe in who he is, even before we can see all that he has done.